The last rail needed to complete the greatest railroad enterprise of the world is about to be laid. The last spike needed to unite the Atlantic and Pacific by a new line of travel and commerce is about to be driven to its place to perform these acts.
The last spike is a regular iron railroad spike that can be driven with the maul. Now, both the maul and the spike are wired to the Transcontinental telegraph line so that the entire nation may hear the blows as the spike is driven.
The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in this lonely valley of northern Utah on May 10th, 1869, signaled the end of a strenuous construction race between the Union Pacific Railroad building west from Omaha, Nebraska, and the Central Pacific building east from Sacramento, California. Today is one of the annual reenactments of this event at the Golden Spike National Historic Site, Promontory, Utah.
Hip, hip,
Details of this event have remained vivid because of the photographs taken that day in 1869. The photograph, the East and West shaking hands at the laying of the last rail, captured that historic moment and became a symbol of national pride in the great achievement. The man behind the camera was Andrew J. Russell.
In 1969, the Oakland Museum History Department acquired a very large collection of glass plate negatives dating from 1868 and 69, made by Captain Andrew J. Russell. The subject matter was the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad westward from Omaha to Promontory, Utah. Quite aside from being a magnificent record of one of the great technological and economic works of the day, the Russell collection is quite literally a crown jewel of American photography, and one that's very little known.
Russell's photographic work has remained virtually unknown in spite of the popularity of his East meets West image. His Union Pacific photographs were credited to William H. Jackson, Charles R. Savage, and Stephen J. Sedgwick. Even his Civil War images were credited to Matthew Brady. Now these errors can be corrected.
Not only did he photograph the Civil War, but he photographed the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. He was an artist, and I think that's obvious if you study his work. He had a very fine eye. He had an incredible technical ability.
These engines are, we think, within a quarter of an inch of being exact replicas of the original locomotives that they represent. A.J. Russell was an invaluable source for us because we looked at all the A.J. Russell photographs of that series of engines because some of them were made on the right, some of them were made on the left, in different angles, so we could get a lot of the details that we would have been absolutely lost without. We found some little things that had not been engineered into the drawings that we incorporated into the locomotives. As an example, the painting on the sand dome on the left-hand side had been photographed many times, and we sort of have nicknamed him Johnny Appleseed.
Russell's photographs are important not only because he documents this great construction effort, but also because he shows the transition which occurred as they moved from mule teams to the railroad and illustrates very vividly the techniques and the lifestyles of the people who were involved in this construction project.
The pictures of Russell are important to me as a historian, or to any historian, because through these pictures we can verify the things that we are able to glean out of our research.
Andrew J. Russell grew up in Nunde, a village in western New York. He received his early artistic training from a local artisan. Using the nearby Genesee River as inspiration, Russell placed the river landscape in the background of portraits he painted of his half-brother William G. Russell and his family in 1850. In the late 1850s, he moved to New York City and started a portrait studio. In 1861, the Civil War broke out. Russell painted a large panorama of the war using illustrations from the newspapers Frank Leslie's Illustrated and Harper's.
The painting of the diorama encouraged the artist to document the war from life, and he enrolled as captain of Company F of the 141st Regiment of the New York Infantry.
In March 1863, Russell received a special assignment in Alexandria, Virginia, under Brigadier General Herman Haupt. It was here he learned photography. He was the only Civil War photographer with a military appointment.
His painting background seems to have helped him a great deal in his later photography, not so much in the sense that he photographed like a painter, but that it gave him a very fine visual sense, that he looked at the world very intelligently.
Throughout the war, he documented many historic events. The activities of the Construction Corps, which kept the supply lines open for the Union Army. The Battle of Fredericksburg. The capture of Richmond. Russell wrote of the battles.
The whole world seemed alive. Every road was teeming, and the call to arms seemed to find a response from every foot of ground. The rumbling of artillery, the clatter of cavalry, the tramp of infantry, the shrieking of locomotives calling men to their posts plainly told that the time had come, that the destiny of a nation hung in the balance.
Perhaps Russell's most famous Civil War photograph is the Confederate Dead behind the Stonewall. It depicts the human debris of battle and the terrible waste of war. Today, the National Park Service maintains the Stonewall at the Fredericksburg battlefield as a National Historical Site.
In September 1865, he was honorably discharged from the United States Army. He looked west for future photographic assignments.
His interest in railroads drew him to the construction sites of the Union Pacific. Once again, he found himself photographing events which would shape American history.
The crews started out of Omaha, worked their way across Nebraska. They went through places like North Platte, through Cheyenne, into Utah, and then up around the north end of the Salt Lake, and to the final joining of the rails at Promontory in 1869.
Russell began his photographic record of the railroad in the spring of 1868, 4 years after the Union Pacific had broken ground in Omaha. Susan Williams, Russell's biographer, is seeking locations where he took photographs in Wyoming.
As Russell's biographer, having studied his life for over 10 years, I'm really thrilled to be here where he photographed. The diary of O.C. Smith, who was cashier on the Union Pacific Railroad, reads that Russell photographed at this spot on April 29, 1868, and that he took some very fine, large views. In his publication, The Great West Illustrated, Russell describes the Dale Creek Bridge as being 125 feet high
and 500 feet long. Nearly all of the timber of which it is built was transported from Chicago. The bridge was completed in 30 working days.
Russell made his headquarters at Laramie and then near Green River during 1868.
The windmills at Laramie are used for raising water. They are self-regulating, ingenious in construction, and durable, having never failed to supply the demands of the railroad. The Laramie Hotel was built by the railroad company at a cost of nearly $70,000. Its dining room will compare very favorably with those of the best buildings for like purposes in any state of the Union.
One of Andrew Russell's real classic pictures was one that he took at Fort Sanders along the Union Pacific Railroad route. It depicts Ulysses S. Grant prior to him becoming President of the United States, along with a lot of military people standing in front of a building there at the fort. Grant, with other Army officers, had come out, had been present at the Treaty of Fort Laramie, where Red Cloud and most of the warring Sioux had come in and signed the treaty. And after the treaty was over, Grant had then come back down to Fort Sanders and was present at the time this picture was taken. This is important to the historian. We can read in the diaries and the journals that Grant was present, that he was at the Treaty of Fort Laramie, that he'd been very instrumental and played a very important role in this treaty. But yet Russell comes along in 1868 there at Fort Sanders, is able to take a picture of him to help verify the accuracy of this. It's interesting to see Grant in this picture, to see how he dressed, to see his age. It's interesting to compare him to other Army officers like Sheridan and Sherman, who were very important officers at this time.
Russell's photographs are particularly important because they document a pivotal time period in the history of the American West. His documentation of the massive numbers of mule teams which were involved in hauling the fill, in cutting the cuts through the mountains, and the number of men which were required provide some insight into the amount of effort and labor which was required prior to mechanization of construction techniques.
Building a railroad was a back-breaking mule skinning feat, and so was photographing it.
Nowadays, with modern technology, you and I can take a 35mm camera and fire off 36 photographs in the space of just a few seconds. In Russell's day, the matter was very much different. To begin with, his equipment was much more massive. This is a camera typical of about the size he would use. What he would do first is find his locale. He would unload the camera, set it up, compose the image in the ground glass, and when he was satisfied with focus and composition, he would go back to his wagon, on which he had a light-tight booth. Russell would take a plate of glass from a large oak box. He would take a jar of collodion, pour a small puddle into the middle of the glass. Collodion was a sticky, foul-smelling substance that was made of gun cotton dissolved in ether and alcohol. He couldn't afford to breathe the fumes for very long. He would carefully rock the plate to evenly coat it with collodion, pour the excess off into the jar, take the plate, still sticky, dip it into a vat of silver nitrate, which would sensitize it. While the plate was still wet, and it had to remain wet throughout the process, otherwise it lost its sensitivity, he would place it into a holder, a light-tight holder. Having removed the ground glass from the camera, he would put in the plate holder and make his exposure. Depending on how he had set his lens, depending on the light available, depending on how his chemistry was behaving that day, the exposure could run anywhere from several seconds to several minutes. He had no shutter as modern lenses do today. He simply removed the lens cap from the lens, and when he figured the time was about right, he put it back on. He'd take the holder back to the light-tight booth on the wagon. Again, he would take the plate, balance it on his hand, pour the developer in the middle, and carefully cover the plate very evenly with the developer. Pour off the excess of the developer, fix and wash it in several trays of water and fixer, dry it, and varnish it, all on the spot. It was a very lengthy and involved process. After he completed all his processing, what he emerged from his light-tight dark booth with was a finished negative like this. One of Russell's contemporaries, William Henry Jackson, said that on a day when he was working very, very fast, it took him a full half hour from the time he first began to unpack his mules to the time he finally got his mules repacked. That's half an hour per exposure, bare minimum. Russell was obviously spending a great deal of time just doing photographic housekeeping in his photography.
Russell frequently placed people in his photographs to emphasize the immensity of the land and to aid in his aesthetic balance. Not far from the advancing rail route stood the U.S. military post Fort Bridger. Russell visited the post in the fall of 1868.
Fort Bridger was abandoned in 1890, as were many other western forts. For the next 30, 40 years, very little was done here. The fort fell into disrepair. Many of the buildings were carried off by local ranchers. A photographer like Andrew Russell is God sent in that he took pictures here on this site in 1868, which enables us as the historians to come along, to look at those pictures and to verify the sites of these buildings, to verify what the buildings actually look like, to verify what their constructions were like, and for a state like Wyoming to come along and start a program of rebuilding a fort site like Fort Bridger. These pictures are invaluable in that they can take these pictures now and they're able to reconstruct those buildings just as closely as possible.
The construction camps flourished often for a period of only a few short months, and Russell's photographs, because of their clarity and because of his attention to detail, provide some fabulous information which shows the types of buildings which were constructed and all of the other accoutrements which went with a community which catered to the needs of the construction workers.
In the fall of 1868, Russell drove his photographic wagon from Wyoming down Utah's Echo Canyon.
The Sphinx of the Valley. This unique figure, bearing a drawn resemblance to the Egyptian Sphinx, is located in Echo City.
Russell's photographs show what the community was like at a specific point in time, and thus provide a reference point against which previous and post-development and growth can be measured. Some of Russell's photographs, such as those of the small communities, for example, Coleville, a Mormon community, document very clearly the lifestyle of the Mormon pioneers, the contrast between the older temporary log and sod roof covered houses of the earliest pioneers and the more substantial dwellings which began to come into existence in the late 1860s and 1870s. More importantly, they illustrate that outside of Salt Lake City, the Mormon settlements were primarily miniature farm villages with the farm actually in the town.
Crossing the mountains from Echo City into the Salt Lake Valley, he visited the territorial capital.
The Valley of Salt Lake has been made a marvel of productiveness by its system of irrigation, though this valley is no better and no different from hundreds of others lying between Salt Lake City and Omaha. Industry has recovered this one from barrenness and desolation, and can and will the others. The foundation of the great temple is seen in the foreground, and Brigham Young's residence in the middle distance. The house with many windows is called the Lion House, and is occupied by the family of the Mormon prophet.
Snow had fallen on the Wasatch Mountains by the end of October as Russell climbed out of Echo Canyon. He found Jack Casement's track-laying crew at work near Bear River, Wyoming.
The workmen have lived on the cars of this train since the commencement of the building of the road at Omaha. the supply train. This was the last siding at the rim. At this point, all supplies were unloaded from the cars and shipped forward to the graders, contractors, and others by mules and ox teams.
Russell returned to New York City in December to write the text and make prints for his publication, The Great West Illustrated. He also published his first series of stereo views.
They were used basically as promotion. They were used to show people just what this unexplored and largely unknown portion of the country was like. They were used to encourage immigration, to encourage settlers, to encourage tourism, and most importantly, they were used to encourage investment by Eastern investors in the railroad and in the West in general.
In the spring of 1869, Russell returned to Utah to photograph the joining of the rails. Russell remained in the West during the summer of 1869, once again making his headquarters at Echo City.